Alfred Adler, 1870 to 1937. Because he broke with Freud in the year 1911, Adler is usually considered the first proponent of the social psychological approach to psychoanalysis. He developed a theory in which social interest plays a major role, and he is the only psychologist to have a string quartet named after him. Adler was born to wealthy parents in a suburb of Vienna, Austria. His childhood was marked by illness, jealousy of an older brother, and rejection by his mother. He thought of himself as puny and unattractive. Adler felt closer to his father than to his mother. She was colder in her nature, and it is probable that she preferred her firstborn to Alfred. He did not understand and never quite forgave her for smiling soon. He thought far too soon after the sudden death of a little brother. How could a child trust a mother like that? Adler later rejected the Freudian definition of the Oedipus complex, perhaps because, as was true for Jung, it did not reflect his own childhood experiences. The younger Adler worked intently to become popular with his peers and eventually achieved the self-esteem and acceptance he had not found within his family. Initially, Adler was a poor student, so inept that a teacher told his father that the only job the boy was fit for was being a shoemaker's apprentice. Through persistence and dedication, however, Adler arose from the bottom to the top of his class. He strove academically and socially to overcome his handicaps and inferiorities, thus becoming an early example of his later theory of the necessity of compensating for one's weaknesses. Inferiority feelings, at the core of his system, are a direct reflection of his childhood, a debt Adler acknowledged. Those who are familiar with my life work, he wrote, will clearly see the accord existing between the facts of my childhood and the views I expressed. Adler recalled that at age 4, recovering from a near-fatal bout of pneumonia, he resolved to become a physician, and in 1895 he received his medical degree from the University of Vienna. He specialized at first in ophthalmology and practiced general medicine. When he became interested in psychiatry in the year 1902, he joined Sigmund Freud's weekly discussion group on psychoanalysis, one of the 4 original charter members of the group. Although he worked closely with Freud, their relationship was never close nor personal. Freud once said that Adler bored him. Over the next several years, Adler developed a personality theory that differed in several respects from Freud's, especially with regard to Freud's emphasis on sexual factors. In the year 1910, Freud named Adler president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in an attempt to reconcile their growing rift, but by 1911 the inevitable split was complete. Their parting was intensely bitter. Adler described Freud as a swindler and psychoanalysis as filth. Freud referred to Adler as abnormal and driven mad by ambition, as well as paranoid, jealous, sadistic, and short. During the Great War from 1914 to 1918, Adler served as a physician in the Austrian army. He later organized child guidance clinics for the Vienna school system. During the 1920s, his social psychological system, which he called individual psychology, attracted many followers. Again, individual psychology is Adler's theory of personality. It incorporates social as well as biological factors. He made frequent visits to the United States to lecture and was appointed professor of medical psychology at New York's Long Island College of Medicine. His talks and his writings in America were immensely popular. A biographer noted that Adler's geniality, optimism, and warmth, coupled with an intensely ambitious drive, made it easy for people to accord him celebrity status and accept him as an expert on human nature. Adler died of a heart attack in Aberdeen, Scotland, while on a strenuous speaking tour. Freud, replying to a letter from a friend expressing sadness at Adler's death, revealed his lingering bitterness over Adler's defection from his own point of view when he wrote, quote, "I don't understand your sympathy for Adler. For a Jewish boy out of a Viennese suburb, a death in Aberdeen is an unheard of career in itself and a proof of how far he had got on. The world really rewarded him richly for his service in having contradicted psychoanalysis." End quote. Adler believed that human behavior is determined largely by social forces, not biological instincts. He proposed the concept of social interest, defined as an innate potential to cooperate with others to achieve personal and societal goals. Our social interest develops in infancy through learning experiences. In contrast to Freud, Adler minimized the influence of sex in the shaping of one's personality. Again, social interest is Adler's conception of an innate potential to cooperate with other people in order to achieve personal and societal goals. Also, Adler focused on conscious rather than unconscious determinants of behavior. Whereas Freud associated present behavior with past experiences, Adler believed we are more strongly affected by our plans for the future. Striving for goals or anticipating coming events can influence present behavior. For example, a person who fears eternal damnation after death is likely to behave differently from a person with a different expectation. Whereas Freud divided personality into separate parts, that is, the it, I, and above I, Adler emphasized the unity and consistency of personality. He posited an innate dynamic force that channels the personality's resources toward an overriding goal. This goal for all of us is superiority in the sense of perfection, and it represents the complete development and fulfillment of the self. Another crucial difference between Adler and Freud was their views on women. Adler argued that there was no biological reason, such as Freud's concept of penis envy, for any alleged sense of inferiority women might feel. Adler charged that this was a myth invented by men to bolster their own alleged sense of superiority. Any inferiority women might feel resulted from social forces, such as sex role stereotypes. Adler believed in equality for the sexes and supported the women's emancipation movements of his day. Adler proposed a generalized feeling of inferiority as a major motivating force in behavior, as it was in his own life. Initially, Adler related his feelings of inferiority to physical defects. The child with a hereditary organic weakness will attempt to compensate, to overemphasize the deficient function. A child who stutters may, through conscientious speech therapy, become a great orator. A child with weak limbs may, through intensive exercise, excel as an athlete or a dancer. Adler later broadened this concept to include any physical, mental, or social handicap, either real or imagined. In infancy, a child's helplessness and dependence on other people awaken the sense of inferiority. Thus, Adler believed it is a feeling experienced by all of us. Conscious of the need to overcome it, the child at the same time is driven by the innate striving for the betterment of the self. This pushing and pulling process continues throughout life, propel and link us toward greater accomplishments. Inferiority feelings operate to the advantage of the individual as well as society because they lead to continuous improvement. If in childhood these feelings are met with pampering or with rejection, however, the result can be abnormal compensatory behaviors. Failure to compensate adequately for inferiority feelings can lead to the development of an inferiority complex, which renders the person incapable of coping with life's problems. Again, an inferiority complex is a condition that develops when a person is unable to compensate for normal inferiority feelings. According to Adler, the drive for superiority or perfection is universal, but each of us behaves in different ways as to try to reach that goal. We demonstrate our striving in a characteristic mode of responding by developing a unique style of life. This style of life involves the behaviors by which we compensate for real or imagined inferiorities. In the example of the physically weak child, the style of life may include exercise or sports that will increase stamina and strength. The style of life is fixed by the age of 4 or 5, according to Adler, and becomes difficult to change thereafter. It provides the framework within which all later experiences in life are dealt with. Again, we see that Adler recognized the importance of the early years of life, but he differed from Freud in believing that we can consciously create a lifestyle for ourselves. Adler's concept of the creative power of the self suggests that we have the capacity to determine our own personality in accordance with our unique style of life. Certain abilities and experiences come to us through heredity and environment, but the way we actively use and interpret these experiences provides the basis for our personality, our attitude toward life. Adler meant that each of us is consciously involved in shaping our personality and destiny. We can determine our fate rather than have it determined by past experiences and by unconscious forces. In examining his patient's childhood years, Adler became interested in the relationship between personality and birth order. He found that the oldest, middle, and youngest children, because of their positions in the family, have varying social experiences that result in different attitudes towards life and different ways of coping. The oldest child receives a great deal of attention until dethroned by the birth of the second child. The firstborn may then become insecure and hostile, authoritarian and conservative, manifesting a strong interest in maintaining order. Adler suggested that criminals, neurotics, and perverts are often firstborn children. He also suggested that Freud was a typical eldest son. Adler found the second child to be ambitious, rebellious, and jealous, constantly striving to surpass the firstborn child. Adler himself was a second-born and had a lifelong competitive relationship with his older brother, whose name coincidentally was Sigmund. Even when Adler had achieved an international reputation for his work, he continued to feel overshadowed by his brother, then a wealthy businessman. Adler referred to his older brother Sigmund, not to be confused with Sigmund Freud, as a good, industrious fellow who was always ahead of me and is still ahead of me. Nevertheless, Adler believed that the second-born child is better adjusted than the firstborn or the youngest child. He said that the youngest child in the family was likely to be spoiled and predisposed toward behavioral problems in childhood and adulthood. In addition, an only child may experience difficulties in adjusting to the world outside the family, where he or she is not the center of attention. Adler's theories were warmly received by those who were dissatisfied with Freud's image of a human personality being dominated by sexual forces and governed by childhood experiences. It is, after all, far more pleasant and hopeful to think that we are able to consciously direct our own development and strive to better ourselves, regardless of genetic limitations and childhood events. Adler presented a far more satisfying and optimistic view of human nature. Individual psychology did not lack critics, however. Many psychologists claimed that Adler's theories were superficial and relied on common sense observations from everyday life, which isn't a bad thing. But others considered his ideas shrewd and insightful. Freud said that Adler's system was too simple. It could take 2 years to learn psychoanalysis, Freud argued, because of its complexity, but Adler could be mastered in a few weeks because with Adler there was little to know. Adler said that was precisely his point. It had taken him 40 years to make his psychology simple. The criticisms of experimental psychologists on the work of Freud and Jung also apply to Adler. His observations of patients cannot be repeated or verified, nor were they obtained in controlled and systematic fashion. He did not attempt to confirm the accuracy of his patients' reports and did not explain the procedures by which he analyzed his data and reached his conclusions. Although many of Adler's concepts resist attempts at scientific validation, the notion of birth order has been the subject of considerable research since Adler's time. Studies showed that firstborns are high in intelligence and the need to achieve, and they tend to experience anxiety when a second child becomes part of the family. Firstborns are also more likely than laterborns to complete more years of formal education, to work in more prestigious occupations, and to achieve greater eminence in their careers. British research has found that firstborns are far less likely to suffer from PTSD, which is known as post-traumatic stress disorder, than those who are much later born in large families. The later borns were found to be more subject to stress and adjustment disorders. These findings are generally supportive of Adler's views. There is less research, however, and support for Adler's contention that secondborns are more competitive and ambitious than their siblings. However, some recent studies are raising questions upon this matter. One study of 700 brothers who played Major League Baseball found that younger brothers were 10 times more likely to steal bases than their older brothers and were also superior in overall batting success. These and other studies also showed that younger siblings were far more likely to participate in high-risk activities, such as skydiving. Research does not support Adler's view that only children are more selfish and have difficulty adjusting to the real world. In fact, studies actually show that only borns tend to be higher in achievement, intelligence, initiative, industriousness, and self-esteem. Adler's influence on post-Freudian psychoanalysis has been substantial. The work of the ego psychologist, which focuses more on rational, conscious processes than on the unconscious, follows Adler's lead. His emphasis on social forces and personality is seen in the work of Karen Horney. The creative power to shape one's style of life influenced Abraham Maslow, who wrote, quote, "Alfred Adler becomes more and more correct year by year. As the facts come in, they give stronger and stronger support to his image of man," end quote. That was Maslow in 1970. Adler's focus on social variables can be seen in the work of the social learning theorist Julian Rotter, who wrote nearly 50 years after Adler's death that he continued to be impressed by Adler's insights into human nature. And that was Rotter in the year 1982. Adler may have been ahead of his time in recognizing social and cognitive variables. These ideas are much more compatible with contemporary psychology than they were with the psychology of his own day. Although many of Adler's ideas have become widely accepted, his public acclaim declined after his death, and he was received relatively little credit for his contributions. Many concepts have been borrowed from his theory without proper acknowledgement. For example, in the London Times obituary for Sigmund Freud, Freud was named as the originator of the term inferiority complex. When Carl Jung died, the New York Times reported that he had coined the term. Neither paper mentioned Adler. Adler's followers claimed that individual psychology remains influential among psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and educators. Individual Psychology, the Journal of Adlerian Theory, Research and Practice, is published quarterly in the United States, and other Adlerian journals are published in Germany, Italy, and France. Adlerian training institutes operate in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and elsewhere in the United States, Canada, and other parts of Europe. Karen Horney, 1885 to 1952. An early feminist, Karen Horney was trained as a Freudian psychoanalyst in Berlin. She described her work as an extension of Freud's system rather than an effort to supplant it. Horney was born in Hamburg, Germany. Her father was a devout, domineering, morose ship captain, many years older than her mother, who was a liberal and vivacious woman. Her mother made it clear to Karen that she wished her husband were dead and that she had married him only out of fear of remaining a spinster. Her mother rejected Karen in favor of the firstborn brother, whom Karen envied simply for being a boy, and her father constantly belittled and berated her appearance and intelligence. As a result, she felt inferior, worthless, and hostile. "Why is everything beautiful on earth given to me?" she wrote in her diary at age 16. "Only not the highest thing, not love. I have a heart so needing love." And Karen wrote that in 1980. This lack of parental love fostered what Horney later called basic anxiety and provides another instance of the impact of personal experience on a theorist's views. A biographer wrote, quote, "In all her psychoanalytic writings, Karen Horney was struggling to make sense of herself and to obtain relief from her own difficulties," end quote. As an adolescent, Horney developed emotional crushes as part of her search for the love and acceptance she lacked at home. She began a newsletter she called a virginal organ for super virgins, and took to walking streets known to be frequented by prostitutes. In her diary, she wrote, "In my imagination there is no spot on me that has not been kissed by a burning mouth. In my imagination there is no depravity I have not tasted to the dregs." Despite vigorous opposition from her father, Horney entered medical school at the University of Berlin in the year 1913, and she received her degree. She married, had 3 daughters, 2 of whom would later need analysis to help them deal with their conflicts with their mother, and became increasingly depressed. She described a long period of marital problems, unhappiness, and oppression. She complained of crying spells, stomach pains, chronic fatigue, compulsive behaviors, and an inability to work, and thoughts of suicide. After several affairs, she divorced her husband and continued her relentless quest for acceptance and love for the rest of her life. She had a number of love affairs, one after the other. A biographer wrote that, quote, "When she did not have a lover or a relationship was breaking down, she felt lost, lonely, desperate, and sometimes suicidal. When she was involved in a morbidly dependent relationship, she hated herself for her inability to break free. She attributed her desperate need for men to her unhappy childhood." Her most enduring affair, lasting 20 years, was with the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, who was 15 years younger. When the relationship ended, she was devastated. She underwent psychoanalysis to deal with her depression. Her Freudian analyst told her that her search for love and attraction to forceful men reflected childhood Oedipal longings for her powerful father. She did not believe that Freudian analysis was helping, so she turned to self-analysis, a practice she continued throughout her life. Sensitive to Adler's observation that physical unattractiveness caused inferiority feelings, she concluded that by studying medicine and engaging in promiscuous sexual behavior, she was acting more like a man than like a woman. This helped her feel superior, but she never stopped her search for love. As she aged, she found younger and younger men, many of whom were analysts whose training she was supervising. Her attitude toward them was casual and detached. Telling a friend about one young man, she said that she did not know whether to marry him or to get a Cocker Spaniel. She chose the dog. From 1914 to 1918, Karen Horney took orthodox psychoanalytic training at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. Later, she became a faculty member there and began a private practice. She wrote journal articles about problems of the female personality, outlining her disagreement with certain Freudian concepts. In the year 1932, she went to the United States as Associate Director of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis. She also taught at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and continued to see patients. Her growing disaffection with Freudian theory soon led her to break with this group. She founded the American Institute of Psychoanalysis and remained its head until her death. Horney disputed Freud's view that personality depends on unchanging biological forces. She denied the preeminence of sexual factors, challenged the validity of the Oedipal theory, and discarded the concepts of libido and the 3-part structure of personality. However, she did accept unconscious motivation and the existence of emotional, non-rational motives. Counter to Freud's belief that women are motivated by penis envy, Horney argued that men are motivated by womb envy. They are jealous of women for their ability to give birth. She believed that men express womb envy and resentment unconsciously through their behaviors designed to harass and belittle women. By denying women equal rights, limiting their job opportunities, and downgrading their efforts to achieve, men attempt to retain an alleged natural superiority. To Horney, the fundamental reason for such masculine behavior is a sense of inferiority resulting from womb envy. Horney and Freud also differed in their views on human nature. Horney wrote, quote, "Freud's pessimism as regards neuroses and their treatment arose from the depths of his disbelief in human goodness and human growth. Man, he postulated, is doomed to suffer or to destroy. My own belief is that man has the capacity as well as the desire to develop his potentialities and become a decent human being. I believe that man can go on changing as long as he lives. End quote. And that was Karen Horney in 1945. Basic anxiety is the fundamental concept in Horney's system. She defined it as the feeling a child has of being isolated and helpless in a potentially hostile world. That was in 1945. This definition certainly characterized her own childhood feelings. Basic anxiety results from parental actions such as dominance, lack of protection and love, and erratic behavior. Anything that disrupts a secure relationship between child and parents can produce basic anxiety. Again, basic anxiety is Horney's conception of pervasive loneliness and helplessness, feelings that are the foundation of neuroses. Thus, the condition is not innate but results from the social forces and interactions in the child's environment. Instead of accepting Freudian instincts as motivating forces, Horney proposed that the helpless infant was driven by the need to seek security, safety, and freedom from fear in a threatening world. Horney shared with Freud a belief that personality develops in the early childhood years, but she insisted that personality continues to change throughout life. Whereas Freud detailed psychosexual stages of development, Horney focused on how the growing child is treated by parents and caregivers. She denied universal developmental phases such as oral or anal stage. She suggested that if a child developed tendencies toward an oral or anal personality, these tendencies were a result of parental behaviors. Nothing in a child's development was universal. Everything depended on social, cultural, and environmental factors. And so we see here that Horney and Adler are both differing from Freud, emphasizing the social aspects of life instead of the biological. So, with that being said, to Horney, then, basic anxiety arises from the parent-child relationship. When this socially produced anxiety becomes evident, the child develops behavioral strategies in a way of coping with the accompanying feelings of helplessness and insecurity. If any one of the child's behavioral strategies become a fixed part of the personality, it is called a neurotic need, which is a way of defending against the anxiety. Initially, Horney listed 10 neurotic needs, including affection, achievement, and self-sufficiency. In later writings, she grouped the neurotic needs to 3 trends. In 1945, the first is the compliant personality. It is one who needs to move toward other people, expressing needs for approval, affection, and a dominant partner. The second is a detached personality, one who needs to move away from people, expressing needs for independence, perfection, and withdrawal. The third is the aggressive personality, one who needs to move against people, expressing needs for power, exploitation, prestige, admiration, and achievement. And so we have the compliant personality, the detached personality, and the aggressive personality. Movement toward people implies accepting one's feelings of helplessness and acting to win the affection of others, the only way the person can feel secure with other people. Movement away from people involves withdrawing, behaving so as to appear self-sufficient and avoid dependency. Movement against people involves hostility, rebellion, and aggression. None of the neurotic needs or trends is a realistic way of dealing with anxiety, however. Because they are incompatible, they can lead to conflicts. Once we establish a behavioral strategy for coping with basic anxiety, this pattern ceases to be flexible enough to permit alternative behaviors. When a fixed behavior proves inappropriate for a particular situation, we are unable to change in response to the demands of the situation. These entrenched behaviors intensify our difficulties because they affect the total personality, our relations with other people, with ourselves, and with life as a whole. The idolized self-image provides the person with a false picture of the personality or self. It is an imperfect, misleading mask that prevents neurotics from understanding and accepting their true selves. In donning the mask, they deny the existence of their inner conflicts. They believe that the idolized self-image is genuine, and that belief, in turn, enables them to think they are superior to the sort of person they really are. Horney did not suggest that such neurotic conflicts were innate or inevitable, although they arose from the undesirable situations in childhood. They could be prevented if warmth, understanding, security, and love characterized the child's home life. Horney's views on feminine psychology are considered a major contribution. Many of her feminist positions, stated nearly a century ago, have a strong contemporary ring. She began work on feminine psychology in the year 1922 and was the first woman to present a paper on the topic at an international psychoanalytic congress. That meeting, held in Berlin, was chaired by Sigmund Freud. Horney drew a distinction between the traditional woman who seeks her self-identity through marriage and motherhood, and the modern woman who looks for identity through a career. This conflict between love and work, as Horney saw it, characterized her own life. She chose to focus on work, which brought enormous satisfaction, but she continued to search for love throughout her life. Her dilemma remains as relevant for many women in the 21st century as it was to her, and she fought for women to have the right to make their own decisions in the face of restrictions imposed by a male-dominated society. Horney's optimism about the possibility of avoiding neuroses was welcomed by psychologists and psychiatrists who saw it as a relief from Freud's pessimism. Her work is also noteworthy because she described personality development in terms of social forces, giving little influence to innate factors. The evidence to support Horney's theory, like that cited by Freud, Jung, and Adler, is taken from clinical observations of patients and thus subject to the same questions of scientific credibility. Little research has been conducted on the concepts in her system. Freud did not comment directly on her work, but said once of her, quote, "She is able but malicious." Elsewhere, in a thinly disguised allusion to Horney's work, Freud wrote, quote, "We shall not be greatly surprised if a woman analyst who has not been sufficiently convinced of the intensity of her own wish for a penis also fails to attach proper importance to that factor in her patients." Freud wrote that in 1940. Horney was described as bitter over Freud's failure to recognize the legitimacy of her views. And I would agree. Although Horney did not have disciples or a journal to disseminate her ideas, her work has had considerable impact. The Karen Horney Clinic in New York offers both training and treatment based on her views. Freudian psychoanalysis did not long remain the only approach to explaining the human personality. As we have seen, during lifetime, alternatives were offered by both Jung and the social psychological theorists such as Adler and Horney, and by the neo-Freudian loyalists like his daughter. The study of personality has grown immensely, splintering the field with conflicting viewpoints. Contemporary personality textbooks typically discuss about 15 to 20 theories. Although these systems differ in specifics as well as generalities, they share a common heritage in that they all owe their origin and form, to some degree or another, to the founding efforts of Sigmund Freud. Freud served the same purpose on the psychoanalytic side of psychology's history that Wundt served on the experimental side, a source of inspiration as well as a force to oppose. Every structure, whether actual or theoretical, depends on the soundness of its foundation. Like Wundt, Freud provided a solid and challenging base on which to build. In the early 1960s, less than 2 decades before the 100th anniversary of the formal founding of psychology, a so-called third force developed within American psychology. This humanistic psychology was not intended to be a revision or adaptation of any current school of thought, as was the case with some neo-Freudian positions. Instead, humanistic psychologists set out to replace both of psychology's two main forces at the time, behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Humanistic psychology emphasized conscious experience, human strength and positive aspirations, free will rather than determinism, and the fulfillment of human potential, and a belief in the wholeness of human nature. You can see that these themes are quite different from those of behaviorism or psychoanalysis. and I would agree with certain aspects of humanistic psychology, and also would disagree with certain aspects of humanistic psychology. However, as with all ideas, anticipations of humanistic psychology can be found in the works of earlier psychologists. Consider Brentano, an opponent of Wundt and an anticipator of Gestalt psychology. Brentano had criticized the mechanistic, reductionistic, natural science approach to psychology and favored the study of consciousness as a molar quality rather than a molecular content. Culp demonstrated that not all conscious experience could be reduced to elementary form or explained in terms of responses to stimuli. James argued against the mechanistic approach and urged a focus on consciousness and the whole individual. Gestalt psychologists believed psychology should take a wholes approach to consciousness. In defiance of behaviorism's dominance, Gestalt psychologists continued to insist that conscious experience was a legitimate and fruitful area of study. Roots of the humanistic position can also be found in psychoanalysis. Adler, Horney, and other personality theorists disagreed with Freud's notion that our lives are governed by unconscious forces. These dissenters from orthodox psychoanalysis believe that we are conscious beings who possess spontaneity and free will, and who are influenced by the present and future as well as by the past. These theorists credit the personality with the creative power to shape itself. As always, the spirit of the times was influential in organizing precedents and trends into a cohesive new viewpoint. Humanistic psychology reflected the disaffection of the 1960s that was voiced against mechanistic and materialistic aspects of Western culture as a whole. The counterculture of the time was composed of so-called hippies, primarily college students and dropouts, some of whom relied on hallucinogenic drugs to stimulate and expand their conscious experiences. As a group, they shared ideals consistent with the humanistic approach to psychology, a focus on personal fulfillment, a belief in human perfectibility, an emphasis on the present, and on hedonism, which is satisfying one's pleasure-seeking instincts, the tendency to self-disclose, or to speak one's mind freely, and the valuing of feelings over reason and intellect. So, to speak on the nature of humanistic psychology, to humanistic psychologists, behavioral psychology was a narrow, artificial, and sterile approach to the understanding of human nature. They believed that the focus on overt behavior was dehumanizing and reduced human beings to the status of animals or machines. They disputed the contention that we function in a predetermined fashion in response to stimulus events. Further, humanistic psychologists argued that humans are more complex than laboratory rats or robots and cannot therefore be objectified, quantified, and reduced to stimulus response or SR units. Humanistic psychologists also opposed the deterministic tendencies of Freudian psychoanalysis and the way it minimized the role of consciousness. They also criticized Freudians for studying only neurotic and psychotic individuals. They argued that if psychologists concentrated only on mental dysfunction, how could they hope to learn anything about emotional health and other positive human qualities? By disregarding joy, contentment, ecstasy, kindness, and generosity, for example, to deal instead only with the darker side of the human personality, psychology was ignoring unique human strength and virtues. Thus, in response to the perceived limitations of both behaviorism and psychoanalysis, humanistic psychologists advanced what they hoped would be the third force within psychology. As a serious study of neglected aspects of human nature, humanistic psychology is best expressed in the pioneering works of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers.